Excellent. Good morning. Sorry for the delay. My name's Jeff. I'm in from Minneapolis. This is one of those times a year where this is the second time this month that I've flown north to south. And it's really interesting because the weather is really, really different. And the flowers, I was in St. Louis a couple of weeks ago, and there were flowers and the trees were blooming, and it was really coming from Minneapolis where everything's still really, really brown. It was very weird. Anyway, it's great to be here. I'm glad so many folks showed up, and I'm glad that you pulled it out and sold out the event eventually. So, I make my living as a consultant, and I specialize in helping companies deliver continuous value. And that focus is a reflection of my background, which is 30 years of building systems and leading organizations across the entire development, QA, and operations spectrum. But I'm also very strongly influenced by design thinking in general and service design in particular. And as I work with new approaches to IT, IT as a service, infrastructure as a service, software as a service, it occurs to me at least that service design is really critical to everything that we do. So what I want to talk about today is the importance of service in the context of DevOps. Now, Adrian Cockcroft likes to say that DevOps is a reorg. And when he says that, it's a reflection of something called Conway's law. So how many people here are familiar with Conway's law? And the light is really bright, so I can't actually see very much. Okay, there weren't a lot of hands that went up. So I'm going to assume that, well, I'll ask anyway. How many of you, John, think you could recite Conway's law verbatim from memory? Come on.
Am I going to get graded on this?
I won't make you do it, but...
An organization's structure, an organization's efficiency reflects its structure.
No. So Conway's law comes from a 1968 article called How Do Committees Invent, written by Melvin Conway. And at the time, he was a software engineer and manager, and he was trying to understand how do we design good systems and how do we design systems well. And it's important to understand that for Conway, a system could be anything from a piece of software to a piece of legislation. And what he saw in common among them is that when you're designing something of a sufficient level of complexity, you can't represent it as a single atomic monolithic thing. You have to break it down in some fashion. Your website has a home page, it has a search engine, it has a review mechanism, it has a shopping cart. And as soon as you do that, you now have to approach design on 3 levels. First, you have to figure out how each component should work, what it should look like. Secondly, you have to understand the communication paths or the relationships between each of those components. And finally, you have to understand how that system of components and relationships emerges back into a coherent whole. Because what you're trying to build is a website, not a disembodied collection of modules. Conway then turned his attention to the process of designing these kinds of systems and made a parallel set of observations. Again, if you're designing something of sufficient complexity, you can't do it with a single atomic monolithic person or group. Again, you have to break it down in some fashion. You figure out the search engine, I'll figure out the shopping cart. And again, you now have to think about the design process on 3 levels. How do you design a component that works? How do your design groups communicate with each other? And how does that system of groups and communications emerge back into a coherent organization that's more or less building the same thing in more or less the same way? Now, it's easy to see that these two mirror each other. But Conway took it a step further, and he concluded that one actually drives the other. The shape of your organization drives the shape of your design. And I had an experience early in my career was thinking about this, and I realized that I had this experience that was a perfect illustration of this principle in practice. There was a team of 4 guys, and they were building a large, sophisticated application, and they were all very skilled and very experienced and a little egotistical, and they had a bit of a rivalry among themselves. So what they did was they took the application and they broke it into 4 big pieces and said, you go figure out your piece and I don't care about it, and I'm going to go figure out my piece and I'm not going to tell you about it, and off they went. Now, in those days, one of the things you had to do with every large application was figure out something called memory management. And typically what you'd do is get together and design a common memory management module, and everyone would use it across the application. So who can guess how many memory management modules this application ended up having? Exactly. 4. Each team member built his own to do more or less the same thing in a completely different way, used it in his piece of the application, and ignored all of the others. Now, among other things, this meant that if a new person joined the team, they had to learn 4 different memory management modules and understand where to use each one. So Conway expressed this in the sentence in his article, which has become known as Conway's Law. John, you want to read this for us? All right. Organizations which design systems are constrained to produce designs which are copies of the communication structures of those organizations. In other words, the way that you work together drives what you make. Now, Conway's Law is expressed as a constraint, something we have no control over. But more and more, companies are figuring out how to use it to their advantage, and they're doing what's become affectionately known as the reverse Conway. And the principle is really simple. If you want a particular kind of design, if you make your organization look that way, you're guaranteed to get it. And this is how we end up with the proverbial 2-pizza team. The idea being that companies are figuring out that the most important thing is the ability to go fast, to deliver change quickly, continuously, and safely. And they've decided that the most effective way to do that is to break up their large applications into collections of small, self-contained, loosely coupled microservices. The idea being that it's a lot easier and faster and safer to change 1,000 lines of code than 1,000,000 lines of code. But what they've also figured out is in order to make that work, they have to do the same thing with their organization and break their organization into small, autonomous, loosely coupled teams, each of which has everything it needs to operate, from product and design all the way to operations and support. Now, the DevOps community has really taken hold of Conway's Law in the last few years. You can't shake a stick at a DevOps conference anymore without hearing his name. But it's not the whole article. In the last half page or so, he drops this nugget, which in my mind is more interesting and provocative, and depending on what you make of it, potentially more disturbing. And he starts by saying, given any system design, someone will find a better one to do the same job. In other words, there's no such thing as a perfect design. We've all had the experience of going back to something we did a year ago and looking at it and thinking, well, that was a really dumb way to do that. If I knew then what I know now, I would have done this really differently. And in addition, no matter how much iteration and no matter how much user testing you do, it's impossible to perfectly predict how people will use your design until they do it for real. And you discover that you thought you were trying to solve problem X, and it was really problem X plus Y. Or maybe it was X minus Y. And even beyond that, the very act of using something changes the user. In other words, it changes the design problem. Social media has profoundly transformed who we are, and in the process, it's transformed our expectations of social media. If you look at the kinds of problems that Facebook and Twitter face today, they're different from the problems they faced when they started. And there's no way they could have foreseen those problems because they didn't exist yet. So, you could say that as important as the ability to design is the ability to redesign. But wait a minute. Don't we have a problem here? Doesn't Conway's law tell us that on some level we are doomed to forever stamp out the same designs over and over again? And this is what led to one of the last sentences in Conway's article, which I've taken to calling Conway's Corollary, which I think personally is worthy of deep contemplation. Flexibility of organization is important to effective design. Okay, so let's say we buy that. How are we supposed to do this without falling into some kind of reorg madness? The same company I worked at with the 4 guys who built the 4 memory management modules, say that 4 times fast, had this habit every year and a half or so, they would go through a company reorg where they would switch from being a product organization to a project organization to a matrix organization and back again. So every couple of years they'd make this big announcement. We need to be product-centric because of blah. We need to be project-centric because of blah. And the amount of time, energy, money, and waste involved was monumental. Well, to some degree, microservices and microservice teams point us in the right direction to solving this conundrum. Because what they're really about is moving us out of this industrial era machine metaphor model of system and organizational design, where we try and figure out how things work together and then kind of bolt them down tightly so they run very efficiently and smoothly, and into a more social or biological complex systems model, where you have a large number of simple components that can combine and interact with each other very fluidly and dynamically, and they achieve a level of flexibility and elasticity and resilience. The problem is that if all we do is shatter our systems and shatter our organizations into lots of little pieces, we risk replacing a few large silos with 1,000 little ones. We still have to figure out how do we make all of these pieces emerge back into a coherent whole, and how do we do it without losing the flexibility that we've gained? Well, luckily, the answer's right in front of us, and it's right in the words that we're already using. If we ask ourselves, what is it that we're designing? What are we trying to achieve anyway? The answer is service. We have left the product economy and fully entered the service economy. You can't even buy a font anymore and download it to your website. Instead, you license it, and the font vendor actually serves it up on your behalf from their IT systems. So font companies have gone from being product companies to being service companies. And the thing about service is it's different. And it's different in ways that may be more profound than we realize. Service value is not something that you pour into an object and hand to a customer in exchange for money. Service value doesn't fully manifest until somebody uses your service. The fact that you operate an airport and you have runways and airplanes and security gates and coffee shops doesn't do anyone any good until somebody shows up and tries to fly to another city. And when they do, they bring with them their particular needs and moods and experiences, and those interact with your service systems and with your employees' needs and moods and experiences. And the value arises in that intersection. And this has the effect of taking the sausage factory of business operations, which traditionally has been hidden behind the scenes, in the back office, as it were, and bringing it forward and making it an explicit part of the value equation. I can't remember the number of times that I've called a customer support line and gotten bounced from one agent to the next and one department to the next and constantly had to re-enter my personal information. And what happens is that the service provider's IT systems and workflows, and to some degree even their org chart and their history of corporate acquisitions, begins to surface and directly impact the quality of my experience. So how do we design for service? How do we operate for service? Well, we have to start to turn our attention outward away from ourselves and what we're making and towards helping our customers achieve larger goals. Perhaps ironically, one of the best definitions of service I've encountered comes from ITIL. ITIL talks a lot about service management, and it starts by defining service with this wonderful phrase, which is delivering value by facilitating desirable outcomes. What's important is not the CRM system. What's important is what the salespeople can accomplish because you built and operate the CRM system. And we need to understand that it's service all the way down. Your company is a service provider. Your IT department and HR departments are service providers. Your design group, your development group, your QA group, your DevOps group are all service providers. Your microservices and microservice teams are service providers. Your job is no longer just to do what you do, but it's to help each other accomplish something larger and by extension to help your customer accomplish something larger. Now, if we dig into this idea of service and what it means to provide service, what we're really doing is making a set of promises. Amazon promises to help you get everything you need in your life, from shaving cream to snow tires to books, as quickly and easily and cheaply as possible. And as part of that, they make other promises. If you have an important meeting this week and you're out of shaving cream and you need it quickly and you give them an extra $5, your shaving cream will show up on Tuesday instead of Thursday. And they promise that although they try and automate their relationship with you as much as possible, if you need help and you call customer support, the person who answers the phone will be knowledgeable and courteous and will stay on the line with you until your problem is solved. And in order to keep that promise, they make other internal ones. They promise to evaluate their employees by things like first-time resolution metrics instead of average call time metrics. Now, we could define a promise as a voluntary commitment to provide benefit. And this is really important because it means that we are signing up for something on someone else's behalf. It comes from the inside out and from the bottom up, in contrast to requirements raining down from on high. And so promises can serve as this attractive force that pulls the pieces of our systems and the pieces of our organizations back together into a coherent whole without making them brittle or rigid. Now, you may wonder, why this word promise? On the one hand, it's very intuitive. We all know what a promise is. We all make promises to each other every day, but it might seem a little odd. Well, the thing about a promise is that it's a commitment that may or may not be kept. Sometimes we break our promises. And this is actually really good because it forces us to think about the possibility of failure, and as a result, it ironically increases our chance of success. I had an experience recently. I was trying to get paid by a large European vendor, client rather, I was the vendor. And they had to send me an international wire transfer, and my bank wasn't really set up properly for it, so they had to do things in a very specific way, and it wasn't working. And they would try something, and it wouldn't work, and they would send me an email that said, sorry, we tried to pay you, and it didn't work. And this went around several times, and I started to get frustrated because I wasn't getting paid. And my client within this company started to get frustrated to the point where he sent a scathing email to his own AP department, which he CC'd me on, saying, hey, come on, why can't we take the lead to solve these problems so that this person who was kind enough to fly to Europe and help us can get paid for his time? They were not set up to think about what to do in the case of failure. So promises unify design and operations because they force us to continually think, to continually ask ourselves, Are we keeping our promises? Are we operating effectively? And if not, what needs to change? And even more interestingly, are we making the right promises? Are we promising to make sure our vendor gets paid, or are we just promising to type some things into a computer screen and push a button and report back the results, whatever may have happened? And if not, what needs to change? Promises also unify the design of systems and organizations, because we can use exactly the same language and exactly the same conceptual model to talk about system promises for things like functionality and availability and performance and security, and promises between people and groups. You know, you could think of things like lean UX and DevOps as new kinds of promises. Instead of promising to deliver code that works on my laptop after 3 months, I promise to deliver code that works in a reasonable facsimile of production in 3 days or 3 hours. And when you bring these two together, the unity of design and operations and the unity of systems and organizations, you have the ability to achieve this organizational flexibility that was so important to Conway. And when you deeply understand the nature of service, and you deeply understand the nature of service as making and keeping promises, you begin to see design as continuous. Continuous in the sense that you do it continually through time. Continuous in the sense that you do it through the entire life cycle. You do it in production and operations as much as in earlier phases. Continuous in the sense that you see the design of systems and the design of yourself as the organization that makes those systems as inseparable. And continuous in the sense that you see it happening at every level of the organization, from the microservice and the microservice team all the way up to the entire company and the entire business. Now, when we talk about organizational design, we tend to focus a lot on explicit organizational structures. But the real problem with silos is not that they're separate. It's not that the designer and the developer and the tester and the sysadmin report to different managers. The real problem is that they don't breathe, that they don't have a way to connect in order to create something larger. I have had the privilege in my career to work for some really excellent service agencies, both in IT and design, and been around people who deeply understood what it really meant to empathize with their customers and to go beyond their assumptions about what their customers needed and their assumptions about what they were supposed to do. And as a result, they were able to create greater value. They were able to develop new lines of business. They were able to begin to actually break down the boundaries between themselves and their customers. And so, in closing, when people ask me, well, can you do DevOps? Can you do design thinking? Can you do LeanX, whatever, across organizational silos? Can you do it with outsourced vendors? Can you do it, God forbid, with offshoring? To me, that's not the essential question. The essential question that we need to ask ourselves at every level of the organization, from the company as a whole all the way down to a single two-pizza team, is how do we begin to shift our emphasis away from who am I, how am I structured, what do I do, what do I make, to how do I help? How do I serve? Because to serve really is the essence of service. So thank you very much. It's been a pleasure being here. If you are interested in exploring more about continuous design and service and promises, I've written a book published through O'Reilly. I'd be honored if you'd read it. Thank you.
Are you good with a couple questions, Jeff?
Sure.
Anybody got a question? Got a question? I'm going to hit you first since you're right here.
Did you bring any of the print books with you to sell?
No, but I did bring Coop 50% off coupons.
So coupons are, and yeah, when I met Jeff in Minneapolis, I was like, I like this deep think stuff. Can you just brain dump on me? And he grabbed me and said, you've got to buy my book. And it's the most sincere look I've ever seen in anybody's face. It's like, it's all in there. Please read it. And it's really good. You should. Who else had a question? There's one.
So you were talking about service as a continuous function of the organization.
Mm-hmm.
How does that square with something that I've seen from a lot of developers where they like the new shiny? And if you're doing continuous delivery of a service, then inevitably the developers have to deal with the legacy code and the infrastructure that's already out there. And I don't want to do that because then I can't play with Docker, or then I can't play with Node, or then I can't play with whatever the new hot thing is.
Well, I think it goes all the way back to the last slide of shifting our focus outwards. And that can actually cut both ways, because it's entirely possible that Docker and Node.js and Cassandra and blah, 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 blah can help us deliver better service. And so part of what we're doing, you know, when we're continually asking, are we keeping our promises? Are we making the right promises? Are there better ways to do it? So that creative impetus is a good thing. But it always needs to be balanced again against what's the benefit and for whom. So yes, I think that, and there's nothing new about this. I mean, I've seen this for the past 30 years, is I want to use this thing because I want to use this thing. And I think it's, you know, what we're all learning. I mean, the dev and the QA folks, to some degree, learned this 25 years ago. The dev and the ops folks are learning it now. I think, Chris, you had a statement up there at the beginning, we're in this together.
That's correct.
So we're in this together, which means we're doing it on each other's behalf. So we just need to ask ourselves continually, great, I want to do this nice new shiny thing. Who will it actually help?
And same thing with the legacy code. If you want me to go patch like 10-year-old stuff that no one's looked at in a long time, I don't want to do that. I want to go play with new hotness. You want me to take that out back and shoot it and deprecate it so we can get rid of it? I'm all about that. So what are you asking them to do with the older stack, right? We got any more questions? I think we got time for one more. Nope. Thanks so much, Jeff. Let's hear it for Jeff Sussna, everybody.